And we're back for the instructional module. We're going to look at Chapter 13 again as we move to the qualitative observation phase. If you want to refer back to your text in the Glickman text for Chapter 13, this is somewhat of a review since you've just completed your quantitative observation, but now we're going to look more holistically from the qualitative perspective. So again, I want you to keep in mind that you want to think about the supervisory skills as you collect both quantitative and qualitative data in order to measure instruction. I'm going to keep quantitative still here on the slide because one of the things that you'll be looking at, you still want to put a numerical base on what you see taking place in the classroom. It could be question levels, it could be students on task, it could be time on task, it could be the levels of questioning, it could be success completion on a formative assessment. Then, of course, qualitatively, we're going to look at the overall perspective from the overall quality of the lesson. So again, as you think about observation, remember it is a two-part process. You're going to first describe what has been seen, and then you're going to make an interpretation as to what that means so that you can give feedback to the teacher. Now, this talks about, because this is from the Glickman text, that you're going to describe what took place in the teacher's lesson, sharing non-judgmental observation data. And then Glickman says that the supervisor and the teacher can jointly interpret the data. But I would submit to you that generally in practice at the school level, the supervisor makes the interpretation and then shares that with the teacher. Again, that's because the observation process has more of a summative, evaluative component. Although in Glickman, he really does write a lot about just giving feedback, which would be more of what a mentor would do. Sometimes a department chair if they're not evaluative, or maybe a professional development teacher. So just keep that in mind as you go through the practice, because that is a bit of a nuance from the text and the theory to practitioners at the school level. We also want to keep in mind, again, formative observation instruments are not summative. That's what Glickman says. So an observation that's formative might be just a walkthrough to try to collect data. However, I again would suggest that you think about most administrators, department chairs, assistant principals, content specialists, if they're in an evaluative role, all the information they're collecting does have a summative evaluation component. So just keep in mind, that's why I want you to think about formative versus summative, who is actually collecting the information, the observation, and then what the end result is. So keep that in mind from theory versus practice. What I'm trying to give you is the practitioner approach, or from that lens, versus the textbook, which is what Glickman is sharing here. Now we're going to zoom in again on the qualitative observation process. So each of these is described in the text verbatim and selective verbatim, and that just means jotting down every word or select words or phrases or questions that are shared in the observation. And of course that does have a quite a use in an observation. Let's say you're trying to talk about question levels, you would be able to share that with the teacher if you note the different questions, and you could actually give them objective data. Detached open-ended narrative just means it's wide open for you to describe what's happening in the classroom. Detached meaning it refers to the participant, so if I'm the observer and I sit in the back room quietly, do not interact with anyone in the classroom, I'm detached. Versus if it's participant open-ended, I might talk with the students. I would, in a way, accentuate this one as a preference because I think it is important as a supervisor, administrator, coach, if you're observing coaches, to interact and get information and more of the inside story. A focus questionnaire observation is essentially key questions or key elements. That's when you're looking at some of the checklists, which we'll talk about, like Danielson, where they have very specific information for what we want to observe in a lesson or in an athletic practice. And then educational criticism is essentially that idea of being the connoisseur. And I would also say that administration currently has that essence as well. It's almost like you're an art critic, so you know, as a quality administrator, principal, you know what it is that you want to see for quality instruction, and you're looking to see that, and you're articulating everything, information and feedback to the teacher around what you expect to see and what you did or didn't see take place in that lesson. So a tailored observation system, according to Glickman, is just one where there is no specific system. Then, of course, you can design one. So that could be like a walkthrough instrument or an informal instrument. In most of the school systems around the state, they're going to have it tailored, but it's not going to be up to the school. It's going to be very much a district-wide. Now, let's go back one slide too. Tailored observations can also be quantitative and qualitative, or a combination. And that's where I want you to keep in mind the qualitative and quantitative. You still, if you're talking about behavior management in the lesson and you're going to say that there were students off task, I would suggest that you give a quantitative measure to say exactly how many students and for how many minutes of the lesson were they off task. If you're going to say that it was teacher-centered, because maybe the teacher talked through most of the period, again, having a quantitative measure where you could say how many minutes the teacher spoke compared to how many minutes it was student to student, or in a lab activity, that again provides that objective measure when you're working with the teacher. So this one I'm going to call a tailored instrument. This is just an excerpt of the Danielson framework because it has specifics here: the elements of focus, teacher interaction, importance of content, establishing a culture for learning, managing the classroom. And so the majority of the systems around the state are using some variation of Danielson. So that really is similar to the questionnaire, a focused questionnaire, or a tailored system, because it really is having the observer zoom in on specific components and attributes in a lesson. The only thing that I really want to highlight here for tailored behavior response, this is specifically about on-task, off-task behavior, but what I just like is the charting where the observer notes the time, 10:40, 10:48, 10:53. You may or may not be talking about student timing or interaction, but let's say you have 10:40, that was when the lesson began, and the warm-up or the drill, and then 10:48, they've concluded that. 5 minutes later, they're on to the next activity when you want to think about transitioning. Or let's say at 10:40, they started the lesson and the warm-up, and it wasn't until 11 o'clock that you noted that they moved on to the instruction for the day. 20 minutes, you could argue, is way too much time for a warm-up or a do now. So that idea, again, of quantitatively noting your pieces in a qualitative observation can be helpful. This chart, again, comes back from the same PowerPoint slides that we talked about earlier, just where we looked at quantitative. Now you're looking at qualitative. And again, I would suggest going to the text to get a little bit more background on those options. One last piece I want to talk about is collaborative walkthroughs. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with the informal walkthrough. This talks about the supervisor going into several classrooms and you're trying to get a sense of what the instruction is like, collecting different types of data. So when you zoom in here on data, it can be qualitative data, but it can also be quantitative. And then for the colleagues to share their views in teaching. That would be collaborative, but also just informally. The more times the observer can get in and out of the classroom, the better the chance of getting a true sense of what the instruction is like on a day-to-day basis. Keep in mind these cautions for observation. Certainly your personal experiences and values do play into what you see, what you look at, how you make the conclusions. Your presence may change the chemistry in the classroom. The observation instrument, as we talked about, you're probably going to be using Danielson or possibly one of the athletic checklists that are also found online on Canvas. And then also, when you're new to this process, the skill at recording the data. You can't get everything, and it is a challenge, and it is only over time and practice, and a lot of practice, that you zoom in and you hone your skills as to what you're looking for in a lesson. At the conclusion of collecting that information, then you're going to interpret what the data means, and then you have to go and determine what you're going to do with it and how you're going to share that information with the teacher so that they can learn and grow. Keep in mind that this process really is the one-on-one staff development that we talked about in the very beginning of the course. And I just want you to close out with this reflection when you're thinking about your observation skills. Kind of consider how you would develop your approach to going through the observation process as you get ready for follow-up 3, where you're doing the full observation. And then how do you build your own leadership capacity? What things can you do? What resources might you need from school administration so that you could improve in this process?